Hi everybody, I'm Steve Roggenbuck. Welcome to my podcast. Haven't made an episode in a while, and I guess I'm thinking of changing the direction of the podcast. It might end up being called something else entirely. It might end up, I'll start a new channel or whatever, but right now I'm just trying to really feel it out. I'm trying to feel out the possibilities, the potential. What do I really want to do? And this has been a big thing for me lately in my life. The past year and a half at least now, I've been going through an era of a lot of change, a lot of thought about my own work, my past work, my ideas, my values, what I want to be doing in my life. And it's been really tricky to figure out exactly what I want to do, but I feel one of the best things to do is just try different things and then, get a taste for them a little bit, and then I'll be able to have better data to decide what I want to do. So right now, I've always loved doing a show, like hosting a show, and even when I get on somebody's college radio show to co-host or something, I have usually loved doing that. I get frickin' amped the F up talking. I love talking, and sometimes I get really excited or get really passionate about a specific topic. And so, I love doing the Read Poetry and Eventually Die podcast, but I felt that the form of doing it based on like book reviews, that each episode is about a book, is kind of limiting. Kind of limiting for me. I think a lot of people who maybe could get something from it, just the premise of it isn't exciting to them. They're like, well, I don't need to hear about this poetry book necessarily. I don't read that much poetry, or I don't care about this, never heard of that person, whatever. And so I kind of would like, maybe I'll even still share some poetry through this podcast, but I want to try a little bit just different format where I talk about various different things and sort of frame the episodes differently that way. Y'all ever feel so good about being hit by sunlight? Sometimes I feel like it's food for me, which it may be. My body needs that vitamin D. And here's something that I'm going to just solicit. I'm going to solicit advice from y'all right now, and that is, if you're listening to this and you have strong feelings or deep knowledge about sunblock and skin cancer and related topics of that, what are the effects of sun exposure in different amounts, and how do you recommend that I really learn about this? Because I was looking online, trying to learn about different types of sunblock, and there's natural ones, there's whatever. People say that a lot of the mainstream sunblocks will give they have carcinogens, or they have different metals in them that are not very good for you. You don't want to get too much zinc or aluminum or whatever, copper, I don't know. You gotta know these things. I don't know them yet. But anyway, I found this one person on YouTube who is this like natural holistic doctor or something, and he was talking about how the sun is great for you, and you need to get that sun. And so he's like, and what he said is that it's really funny actually. It's pretty funny. There's this video that he made that I found that, it's just these titles that are totally to scare people and get attention, really. But it's like, there was one that was called, like, Sunscreen Causes Cancer or something like that. And there was another one called, and I'll explain that in a second, but there was another one called Wearing Sunglasses is Not a Good Idea. And I thought that was a pretty funny title. Wearing sunglasses is not a good idea. Not a good idea, y'all. But anyway, yeah, I guess because his take on it was that, sunblock only blocks out certain types of rays that you're getting from the sun anyway, like the UV ray types, but there's other UV rays and there's other types of rays coming from the sun. And so basically, if you have the sunblock, then you block out the ones that cause sunburn. And so, yeah, you can stay in the sun longer without getting sunburn, but all those other rays are still coming from the sun, and those can be harmful for you as well. So, and this guy's take, also he said this, which I don't know if this is true or not, but he said this, that if you're out there in the sun, cooking out there, just baking up, and you're using sunblock on you, And then you get that vitamin D coming through. Now, I don't know how much your body produces vitamin D with sunblock on versus without. I think that's something that's debated, and there's some studies, whatever. But he said one thing is that vitamin D is, this is according to him, vitamin D is produced on the surface of your skin. And then, like, seeps down in and is absorbed by your body over the course of the next 28, 48 hours. But he said that you can wash off a lot of the vitamin D that was produced on the surface of your skin. So, moving on. The sunblock thing is something I need to figure out, so somebody tell me what the heck is up. I should probably just start using any sunblock because it's probably better than not using one, but I don't know. I just want to do it right. I want to do right for my body. I've been thinking a lot about, humans living in harmony with the earth. We are literally animals, and that's somewhat of a cliche for me now because I made that poem that's like, we are animals on a rock in space and all that, but literally we are animals. And it's funny sometimes to realize this. Last fall I was watching my dad eat, and he was eating popcorn or banana or something, and he's just like, he literally looked like a squirrel to me. My dad looked like a squirrel because he had food in his hand, and he was like pushing it into his mouth and chewing it and swallowing it, and I think he was reading a magazine or something, so he wasn't really paying attention, but I was just watching my dad eat, and it was real funny to me. Here's another thing. I've been going on this rant at some of my readings. What if I seriously started to believe, that I was going to live 200 years or more? Do you think that I could? Do you think that I could get closer than anybody else has? Do you think, okay, if I seriously adapted the belief, okay, well, I'll go back to where this starts. One, there's this one story where I read from my storybook. I read it on tour, and at the end it talks about looking up horse facts online. And then I talk to the audience. Sometimes I mention one specific horse fact that I looked up online this day when I was writing this story was the oldest horse to ever live. How old was this horse? Well, the normal age for horses is around 25 to 30 years. This horse was 62 years old. This horse is named Old Billy, by the way. You can look up lots of stuff. Paintings of Old Billy, etc. Old horse. Now, when did he get the name Old Billy? I don't know. He probably was not born with that name. Anyway, what I wanted to say is that, that horse lived over twice the life expectancy of a horse. And what if that happened with a human? What if a human lived to 200? And then I was thinking, what if I just tried really hard to live to 200? And or if a lot of people started doing that, if you seriously believed it, like you seriously planned for it, like you learned everything there is to learn about longevity, right? Because there's a lot of research about, lifespan and various factors, vegetables being one of them. But not just that, also the mindset. If you had the belief that you will live to 200 years old, and you plan for it, and you seriously believe it, I wonder if I could live to 150 at least, if I seriously believe it and seriously try. Because the thing is, a lot of people don't do stuff because they don't try to, and that's whatever. That's a cliche rant too, but I think there's some truth to it. There's at least some truth to it. There are limitations on what a human body can do, but a lot of it is limited by what we think we can do, and the one great example of that, if you haven't heard this story, it's quite interesting, is that the first person to run the 4-minute mile, y'all know about this? It wasn't done for a very long time, maybe ever in humankind. Of course, obviously it wasn't all recorded that well earlier on, whatever, but nobody could run a 4-minute mile. People could get close, but nobody could break that 4-minute mile. And then the one guy did. I think his name was Roger Bannister, whatever. I don't have all the info, but the thing that was wild about it is that the very next year after he broke the 4-minute mile, like 17 other people did it the next year, or like 37 or something. Like a lot of people did it the next year. after not being able to do it for so long, and then the next year after that, like 300 some people did it. And it's like, okay, that was clearly a case of people not giving it their all because they didn't think it was possible or something. Something like that. So what if I could live to 150? What if I could live to 200? People are always asking me, why do you frame your work as poetry? Why do you call yourself a poet? And do you really, should you? Is it the best thing to do? Have you ever considered calling yourself a comedian? Have you ever considered, calling yourself a visual artist, marketing your stuff through the art world more? I think I need a drink of water, but I don't have one out here. I'm going to dehydrate and die. It's okay. It's okay. That was meant to be. Probably a bunch of you know my video, An Internet Bard at Last, 2013. It's my Ars Poetica video is what I called it. And in that one, I was really in a phase of my career where I was really proudly claiming the label of poet because of the emotions, because of the connotations of poetry as something really romantic. A poet as someone who's connected with nature, connected with spirituality, connected with passion, with carpe diem, with like, I will die and I will live to the fullest, and all this. So I was connecting with that sort of trope of a poet, being a poet. And so, capital P, poet. I'm not afraid of it. Some people back down. They're like, not capital P poetry. But I was like, yes, capital P poetry. Because I love to try to be profound. That's the level I was on in 2013, and it worked well for me. Before that, 2011, I was on a different level of saying a lot of things about poetry. I talked about, quote, internet poetry a lot, specifically. And I started a blog called Internet Poetry, which is still going, although it's curated by somebody else now. It's curated by Michael Hessel-Miles since 2012, so I only ran it like 1 year. But I started it. Anyway, it's internetpoetry.tumblr.com. It's lots of, it's text on images, and it's text in animated GIFs and in videos sometimes. Mostly it's image-based on there. But the idea, and this is something that I've still done in lectures to this day. Just on my most recent tour, I went through, and in Toronto I gave this lecture, and a couple other places on tour too. There's this lecture I give called Formal Possibilities for the Poetry of the Internet. And basically I go through and I talk about the broadness of poetry historically. Poetry has really been so many things, and so if anybody tries to tell you that tweets are not poetry, that whatever, this visual drawing you did with words in it isn't poetry, if people try to tell you that your stand-up comedy set isn't poetry, blah, 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 if people try to tell me that my videos aren't poetry, they don't know jack shit about the history of poetry, because the history of poetry is so broad, so many different times the rules have been broken. The limits of what poetry could be have been smashed down and cut down and expanded. And so there is no definition of poetry. There is no outer boundary to what poetry can be. Poetry could be anything. And I believe that is defendable by looking at historical precedents, And so whatever, my lectures, I talk about that a little bit, and then I do show different things. I show different image-based poetry that I've seen in my community and across the internet. I show poetry equivalents of music videos. Very exciting area to work. Of course, I have videos that are more so recorded as video rather than the poem is written first and then a music video is sort of made for it. But whatever, there's all these different possibilities with moving typography and animated GIFs. You can do so many things, and different audio outlets online. There's so many forms for poetry to go in, and you can call it poetry anywhere that you go, and it's defensible and it's whatever, but why call it poetry? That's been an interesting component to me. And in 2013, I found that my answer for why I wanted to call it poetry was because of the connotations of poetry. Well, because it's romantic, because it's about carpe diem, because it's about living life, and I want to be in the same category as Walt Whitman, etc., etc. But I don't always get on that level. 2013, I was very much into the carpe diem. I was very much into that as a constant focus in my work. But lately, I have not. Lately, I've been saying some sincere stuff, but a lot of my focus has been on just humor. You know, my 2014 videos, and a lot of people didn't like them nearly as much as my 2013 because they thought they're way too wacky and random, not enough quote-unquote meaning in them, just me effing around a lot more, joking around. You know, I was focusing a lot more on the humor, and so then it becomes less important to me that I actually use the term poetry. I guess lately I've been in one of these modes where I don't really feel that it's important to call my work poetry, and I'm trying to not let the definition of poetry limit my work and where I go from here. And I guess this is one of the overall things I wanted to say. So many of these categories that we have, whether you're a poet and you call yourself a poet and you study poetry, or whether you're an art student and you study visual art or painting or whatever, or whether you study graphic design, you know, I guess I can only really speak to my own experience, but for me, poetry is not the point. Poetry was never the point. I actually dislike most poetry. I actually find most poetry readings to be extremely boring. I did not read books hardly at all as a kid. It's very hard to find poetry that really engages me that much, that makes me excited. I was so lucky to find some poets who did do things I cared about. When I was a senior in high school, I found E.E. Cummings' poetry, and the personality that he embodied, the sort of playfulness, the playful rebelliousness, he identified as a nonconformist. He even said that stuff himself. He said stuff like, these poems are not for most people. Me and you are not like most people. He identified as somebody who was not the mainstream. And for me, coming from being in the metal bands in high school and loving Slipknot as a 9th grader and literally identifying as a maggot, which is the term that people use for Slipknot fans, I literally very much latched onto that. I was like, you know what? I like to not be the mainstream. I basically liked E.E. Cummings in the same way that people liked being goth or punk. And that was very much my introduction to poetry. And then I found some other poets who were rebellious and who sort of had this attitude of doing things that were, questioning the status quo and stuff. The Dada poets, the anti-art art, and the surrealists and futurists and different movements where they got all amped up. Some of the beat poets, but not super much. Then I found Walt Whitman, and then it was his spirituality, it was his view of the world, it was his positivity, it was the way that he made me look at the world and actually see my everyday life as much more interesting and much more compelling. The reasons that I liked any of these favorite poets of mine is not because of their poetry. It's not because they were poetry. They were simply human beings who were speaking to me about a way of living, a way of being in the world, a type of personhood, an attitude, a personality, something that I could approach in the work and be like, this is helpful to me. This is relevant to me because I want to figure out how I should live as a human being. I'm here on Earth and I don't know what the heck is going on, I got to figure out, what kind of person I want to be. And so that was what it was for me. And that's what it's been for me. That's what it still is for me. In 2014, for example, when I was having a lot more different thoughts about different political things, right? I was starting to think more critically about patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, huge things, imperialism, different things, and I've gone probably the most into thinking critically about patriarchy and capitalism, especially because those were things that I found hints of how they were present in my past work, depending on your interpretations, but, I was like, this form of motivational rant that I did kind of, it might be kind of a capitalist angle because I was talking about it competitively, whatever. And I can talk more about that in another podcast episode, perhaps. And then, certain love poems of mine, I was like, I'm kind of like talking about this other person as really like a, not really acknowledging the full personhood in the poem. I'm kind of just like, I'm going to kiss you this way. I'll frick you that way, whatever, And it's sort of like, it wasn't really like, I don't know, I could write a more feminist love poem, you know what I'm saying? So I got a lot more, in 2014, I got a lot more critical and starting to think about a lot more of those issues more deeply. And then it's interesting, what happened is that, that definitely showed in who became my favorite poets. Who became my favorite poets in 2014? Joshua Jennifer Espinosa, whose book we published through Boost House. If you read that book, it's called I'm Alive, It Hurts, I Love It. And it's a book that I think is amazing. The title captures a lot of it already right there. It does have a spirituality to it. And, there's this engagement with the beauty in the world, but it also has a context of a lot more struggle. And I don't know how to really describe it, but it's like, it became especially important to me because it's like, I care about how to live in the world, and I was becoming more aware of the ways in which it was important for me to engage critically with social and political stuff, and with suffering and with sadness more seriously. And so that became some of my favorite work because it sort of had that balance. And the other poet, arguably, you might not even call him a poet, but Postcrunk, Martin Bell, twitter.com/Postcrunk, just his tweets. Amazing to me, and became one of my favorite things in 2014 because, especially, I already liked his work before that, but it especially became meaningful to me because he does have this spiritual engagement with the world. A lot of you who have liked my messages about, stop pretending it's boring to be alive, whatever, you will like Postcrunk's tweets because he does talk about, like, making this effort to not get jaded to the wonder of, like, living on a planet in outer space and all this, and, like, the weirdness of being a human being. But it's also positioned in this way that he also talks a lot about capitalism and white supremacy and patriarchy and different forces that limit what that spiritual experience of the world can be. He talks about basically that, we're born into this wild, mysterious world, and it could be this amazing, beautiful spiritual thing, and sometimes it is. Sometimes you have those moments, but it's also like so many people have that beautiful, wonderful spiritual experience stolen from them because of these systems that we live in that force people to work for extremely low pay. People are abused. People, are not educated well, people don't have access to different resources, and so it's like you get sort of both sides of it, that there is this spiritual experience here to be had, and yet we got to be pissed off that not everybody can have it, and that these systems are fucking with our ability to even experience it. So those two poets, anyway, what I'm saying is that those two writers became my favorites as that became more important to me to engage critically with different social and political things while also trying to keep some kind of spirituality that makes me hopeful, that makes me appreciate the world, I'm trying to think about what is it that I really am passionate about. It's funny because some people have a very simple passion that they can say, I love basketball, I love gardening, whatever it is. And even those might be loose around the edges or sloppy around the edges or whatever. But for me, it's really been hard to pinpoint what exactly is my passion. Is it really poetry? I don't think it's strictly poetry. There are some poets who are doing stuff that I love and am passionate about, but not as a rule. Not as a rule, and I enjoy reading poetry, but it's not what gets me fired the fuck up. What gets me fired the fuck up, I think, is really this bigger question about how to live. And then I guess my passion of what I enjoy and what I'm probably good at is speaking to people. I love talking in front of an audience. But you know what was interesting on my last tour? I sometimes get at my readings and I start talking to the audience in between poems, and I start, people call that banter at poetry readings, when you read a poem and then you banter a little bit in between. A lot of times it's like contextual stuff, but for me, I've really been going on different rants. I've really been, speaking from the heart. I've really been having like stand-up bits, really, different stand-up bits, kind of, and I've been doing a lot of surveys lately is my newest thing. I love this, I love saying, how many people here think this? And just like improvising a lot of it, but also doing some more premeditated ones where I truly ask people to raise their hand for strongly agree, slightly agree, neutral, slightly disagree, strongly disagree. It's really quite fun. Anyway, sometimes I get so excited talking to the audience that I don't want to read my poem. I don't want to read a story because it seems like going away from the audience, and I don't want to stop talking to the audience. And especially this happens near the end of my poetry sets if I'm having a good one. It's like I don't want to be done. I don't want to stop talking to my audience because I love talking to people. I love sharing things with people. I love literally sharing like my views on life or something. I don't know what it is. I'm still figuring it out, and I think doing this show in a more open way is going to help me figure out exactly what my passion is. But I've loved hosting radio shows. I've loved going on rants. I've loved doing the live streams. Shouts out to anybody listening to this who ever watched any of my live streams on Spreecast or Ustream. Shouts out. Let me know what you thought about this show, the sort of open form where I'm just talking about stuff. And then I've been telling people to tweet at me or Facebook comment me, message me, whatever, with ideas of what you think I should talk about on an episode of this podcast. And, maybe we'll see a pattern emerging, or maybe I'll just keep following my heart. But, yikes. So tell your mom about this podcast. See if we can get some moms in here listening. And also, shouts out to the website being hacked. ReadPoetryAndDie.com literally got hacked by somebody, which is funny. It really doesn't matter to me that much. But shouts out.